no matter how many drawings we've done, we're not always going to be happy with every drawing. So what do we do with the ones that we end up not being so happy with? Sometimes, as in the case with this drawing, I was happy with it at the time, but every time I looked at it, I was less and less happy. But the truth is, a drawing that we're not happy with is a great opportunity to experiment and to play and to push and to try something different, because in a sense, we've got nothing to lose. We've already not achieved what we were trying to achieve, so why not use these drawings to experiment or to try harder, or perhaps most helpfully, to really ponder what we're not happy about with it and try and overcome those things by doing additional work on our drawing. This is the first of 3 drawings I'm going to work over for a second time to try and improve the things I was unhappy with. Now with this, I felt the line work was just too weak. There wasn't enough of it. The hatching didn't create enough contrast and generally just felt all too pale and a bit insipid. So I decided to try and improve this by adding more line work. So let me show you what I did. The first thing I had to do was to work out what pen I'd used, and after a little bit of experimenting with a scrap of paper held close to my page, I worked out it was a 0.3 millimeter pen. And the first thing I attack is this tree on the right hand side. It's probably the thing I was most aware of was really underdrawn, really underdone, and maybe I just got bored with it. So I put a lot more hatching onto that to really develop the parts of the tree that are in shade and overshadowed by other parts. Now, the sun on this day was almost overhead, which meant that often anything we looked at had a very pale shade all the way down its front, including the side of the Brandenburg Gate in the background. But I didn't add that because I didn't want to risk lessening the contrast that we had. But I'm also now working on the darkness between the columns that we can see there, those massive Doric columns at the end. Generally, I'm working on places where hatching has been done or where it should have been done and trying to increase contrast between adjacent forms. So this figure on the left-hand side, I'm darkening the areas behind him and also leaving a slight allowance of white to help just pop the distinction between them. And generally I'm looking at every opportunity for darkening shade or shadow, or sometimes local color. So I am slightly changing the light effect. I'm making it a little more contrasty than it was. And the other place where I can increase my line work also is in the clothing of these people. And so I darken various parts of their clothes, or in the case of the gentleman on the right, just a little bit of light hatchwork on his front, since it's a white t-shirt, or I've drawn it as a white t-shirt. Generally, I don't regard the actual colours of the clothing too much. It's a great opportunity simply to adjust to what works best. And here you can see the 2 of them side by side. Now, they're not the same size. This is from a photo I took earlier. I've basically just put a lot more line work on top. So the value contrasts have been increased. And these figures here, I think, carry a little more weight visually when we look at them. Let's look at the next example. My second drawing was the one that I did yesterday and the one that gave me the idea for doing this, because in the end, while I was happy with lots of the elements of this drawing, I just felt I had too many lines. Between lines to represent brickwork or tiles, and lines to represent outlines of the objects, and lines to represent shade or shadow, I just thought was too many lines, and it was starting to become difficult to really work out what was happening here too quickly. And particularly since my drawing was actually smaller than this print of a photo of it. Now, the video is about line, so I didn't want to do anything else to it. But I did think that adding tone from markers could help just to separate some of the confusing parts, to indicate more easily what was actually happening here and what we were actually looking at. So this second way of rescuing a drawing that hasn't quite worked out as happily as we'd like is to use tone and to establish values that help create more contrast where we need it and help to define the scene that we're looking at. So see whether you think this improves it or not. I decide to go for some of the darkest areas first using an N5, the 6th grade of darkness of the neutral grey colour Copic sketch marker pen that I'm using. And I eventually actually go over that again with an N6, but I start with N5 and then N4 to come around it and do some of the other darker spots. And then I use an N3 and I'm basically working backwards at this point using lighter and lighter tones and then trying to work out what I will leave blank, where I'll let the paper represent whatever's happening on the surface regarding light or colour. Now again, these people on the right hand side, I want to keep them fairly good contrast with the shadows behind, so I leave all their tops white except for one chap who's got the white behind him, so I make his black. So it's all about juggling contrast to create clarity in what we do. I have some fun with the cars to make them a little more interesting since they do take up a fair bit of the foreground. And really there wasn't as much to do with the buildings as I thought, but I did keep working on the foreground to try and create a little more 3 dimensions there. Sometimes we get opportunities with markers that it's hard to have, things that are hard to do with our line alone. And I decided at the end to actually add some value to represent the road surface, which I think worked really well. And now I just darken those first windows. Sometimes we need to adjust the things we did at first now that we've established more accurately the overall values and contrasts in our scene. So here's the finished drawing. What do you think? It's a bit hard to compare with this one because the scale is so different. But if we put them side by side, I think I am much happier with this as a quick sketch. For 10 minutes extra, I think I've been able to clarify all the ambiguity that I created in just the line work alone. It can be very helpful to have half a dozen values of tone tucked away in our drawing supplies so that if something does end up not turning out quite as clearly as we want, we can establish some more clarity quickly and easily with those markers. Let's look at our third example now. This third example of a drawing I wasn't happy with and was really looking for a chance to improve, to rescue, is one that I did of this scene in Edinburgh in conjunction with a video on drawing stonework. It was an early teaching video, and in the end, I really wasn't happy with my tone work. I felt that the values in the end seemed to combine and create a lot more mid-range value than I wanted. And I didn't get the lovely sense of dark shadows and dark weathered stonework, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, that I thought was part of the appeal of the scene. So for this drawing, what I always thought it needed was bolder use of tone work, bolder use of value to increase the contrast and to create greater interest. So this was finally my opportunity to do that. Let's see how it worked out. So I'm starting with an N6, which is probably going to be the darkest pen that I used on this, but it's one tone, one value darker than the 5 that I used on this previously. But I intend to use a lot more 5 on this in place of the 4 that I used, the N4. And I think that's going to make quite a lot of difference. So just having done some of the N6 values in the very darkest spots, I'm now switching to the N5 and I'm now doing quite a lot of changes, just darkening, strengthening. And I do a bit back and forth now between a 6, a 5 and a 4. So I'm not going to be spelling out exactly which one I'm using, but you can tell that I'm just basically applying darker value over what I've already applied. So I'm using a 5 there for that tiling on the roof, the slate on the roof, in place of the 4 that was there previous. Now I still want to allow, we're not just talking about shadow and shade, we're also talking about local colour, because some of the stones are lighter than others, some of them have weathered more darkly than others, and stones towards the ground or at ground level are often darker as well, just because of the increased amount of dirt that gets flung up against them over the years. So for all these reasons, there's a bit of variation to play with. And generally, I'm being bolder with the moves I make. I'm not just relatively darkening all the values compared to what was there before, but I'm making more of them darker than was the case as well. And I'm exaggerating or strengthening the contrast between adjacent areas as well. These two closest figures to us in the lower left-hand part of the drawing, I make them relatively darker than they were before. So what do you think? In some ways, it's still a lighter version of our reference, but it's, I think, come a long way to creating more of the interest, certainly from a value sense, than my original attempt. Now, this has had the colour taken out of it, and this still has the slightly blue-grey effect of the neutral grey colour of the markers. But it does represent well the difference simply in darkness of this drawing as opposed to how it looked earlier. The darker areas are certainly darker. Do you think this is a better version for this scene or not? So a drawing that we're not completely happy with is actually a wonderful opportunity to do some experimenting, to take some risks that maybe we didn't want to take or wouldn't normally take, or to take some elements that we're already using in our drawing but to push them further and see if we can get some more dramatic results. Why don't you go through your drawing collection now and find a drawing that you were never completely happy with, and grab a cup of coffee in half an hour and say, okay, what can I add to the line work, or what can I add to the tonal work, or what can I hide with more line work or hide with more tone work to get this drawing looking closer to how perhaps I wanted it to be when I drew it, or perhaps closer to what I'm able to visualize now, having developed my art experience and skill level since I drew this. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. It was interesting for me to do. It was quite fun to rework some of these drawings that have been annoying me and to get them closer to what I think I was really wanting to achieve in the first place. But hey, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.